Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
I work as a cataloger for a university's ancient artifacts department, which sounds more glamorous than it really is. Most of the time, I'm buried in poorly labeled crates from old excavations. My job is to photograph, document, and classify objects so researchers can study them. It's usually monotonous and solitary work. But last semester, I came across something that's haunted me ever since. One Friday evening, I stayed late to finish a shipment that had been sitting unopened for decades. The box was marked private collection, provenance unknown, and listed no details. Furious, I cracked it open. Inside were a few clay tablets, some fragments of carved bone, and a small bronze figure. Nothing unusual. The last object I unwrapped was a polished stone disc about the size of a dinner plate. It was unnervingly smooth, with concentric grooves etched into its surface. At the center was a spiral, deep and sharp enough to feel with my fingertip. As I turned it over, I saw there was writing along the edge, symbols I didn't recognize. I set the disc under the photography lights and zoomed in. The symbols didn't match any of the scripts I'd seen before, but they seemed oddly familiar. I started feeling dizzy the longer I stared at them. My stomach churned, and my head throbbed like I was coming down with the flu. It was unlike anything I'd ever felt. I decided to call it a night, but when I went to put the disc back in the crate, I noticed something strange. The grooves were glowing faintly, as though there were ember burning beneath the surface. Thinking it was just a trick of the light, I turned off the lamps. The glow didn't stop. That was enough for me. I packed the disc back into the crate and locked up. As I left, I told myself to report the artifact first thing Monday morning. That night, I couldn't sleep. My dreams were filled with swirling shapes and muffled whispers, too faint to understand. When I woke up, my head was pounding and the whispering didn't stop. I could hear it faintly, like static, just on the edge of perception. I was sure I was coming down with something. By Sunday, the whispers were louder, though still indecipherable. Worse, I started catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that darted away whenever I turned my head. I convinced myself it was just stress and lack of sleep. On Monday morning, I went straight to the lab. I was eager to get rid of that artifact, to pass it off to someone else and be done with it. But when I unlocked the storage room, the crate was gone. I reported it missing to campus security, but they found no signs of a break-in. None of my coworkers had seen it. It was as though the crate had never been there. The whispers persisted for weeks, fading only when I was around other people. The shadows, too, grew bolder, flitting across my walls at night, always just beyond reach. I eventually transferred to another department. Over time, I tried convincing myself it was all in my head. I told myself that the stress of overworking, the isolation of my job, and the eerie nature of the artifacts had combined to mess with my perception. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just stress. Something had followed me, and it was patient. Months passed, and while the shadows grew less frequent, they never completely vanished. The scratching at my door became sporadic. Sometimes weeks would go by without a sound, only for it to return, louder and more deliberate. I began sleeping with headphones in, playing white noise loud enough to drown it out. Then one night, everything changed. I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. Groggy, I reached for it, squinting at the screen. It was a notification from the university's internal alert system. Unauthorized access detected in the artifact storage lab. Security en route. My stomach dropped. That lab was supposed to be locked tight. After the incident with the missing crate, extra security measures had been put in place. I knew better than to get involved, but something about the message gnawed at me. Against my better judgment, I got dressed and drove to campus. The building was eerily silent when I arrived, lit only by dim emergency lights. As I approached the lab, I noticed the door was slightly ajar, swinging gently as though someone had just passed through. I hesitated, my heart hammering in my chest, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside, the lab was a mess. Shelves were overturned, papers scattered everywhere. At the center of the chaos was the missing crate, or what was left of it. The wood was splintered, as though something had burst out from inside. The stone disc lay on the floor, its grooves glowing faintly once again. I froze, unsure whether to move forward or run. That's when I noticed the air around the disc. It shimmered, like heat rising from pavement, though the room was cold. And then I saw it, a shadow taller than any human, twisting and writhing as it emerged from the spiral etched into the disc. Its form was impossible to describe, shifting constantly as if it couldn't decide on a shape. What I could see, though, were the eyes, dozens of them, scattered across its body, glowing faintly like the grooves on the disc. They fixed on me. I backed away, nearly tripping over a fallen chair. My breath caught as the shadow extended something resembling an arm toward me. The whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening. They weren't incomprehensible anymore. They were calling my name. I don't remember running, but I must have, because I found myself outside in the parking lot, gasping for air. Security arrived moments later, but I didn't stick around to explain. I drove home and packed a bag, leaving town that same night. I quit my job at the university and moved halfway across the country. It's been a year now, and I haven't heard the whispers or seen the shadows since. But sometimes, late at night, I feel like I'm being watched. The feeling of being watched never truly left. Even after moving, even after trying to rebuild a normal life, there were moments when I felt the weight of unseen eyes on me. Sometimes it was in my own home, a fleeting sensation of something just beyond the edge of perception. Other times it was in public, as if I were a faint signal being tracked, no matter where I went. It happened again a few weeks ago. I had just settled into a new city, a smaller place where I could blend in, surrounded by people but anonymous. I had gone to a local bookstore, hoping to lose myself in the comforting smell of old paper and the quiet hum of life. As I browsed the shelves, a voice called my name. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't out of place. The casual, almost friendly hey, as if someone familiar had just spotted me. I turned, my heart racing, expecting to see someone I knew. But no one was there. The aisle was empty. I shook it off, forcing myself to believe it was a coincidence. Maybe someone else at the store had the same name. I paid for my books and left quickly, scanning every shadow on my way to the car. That night, I had a nightmare. In the dream, I was back in the lab, standing over the broken crate. The disc was glowing brighter now, its grooves swirling faster, almost alive. The shadow emerged again, more defined this time, its shifting form coalescing into something humanoid but still wrong. Its eyes, those countless, glowing eyes, locked onto mine. "You can't run," it said. The voice wasn't like the whispers I'd heard before. It was deep, layered, and reverberated in my chest like an earthquake. "You opened the way." I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. For a moment, I thought I could still hear it breathing in the room, but it was only the sound of the wind against my window. Or at least, that's what I told myself. The next day, things escalated. I take it to avoiding mirrors since all of this began. They always made me uneasy, as if the reflection wasn't quite right. But that morning, I accidentally glanced at myself in the bathroom mirror, and I froze. My reflection was smiley. I wasn't. My mouth was frozen in shock, but the image staring back at me was grinning, wide and unnatural, like it knew something I didn't. My hands trembled as I backed away, but the reflection didn't move. It just stood there, grinning. I don't know how long I stood there, staring, before I grabbed a towel and threw it over the mirror. I haven't uncovered it since. Now, I don't sleep much. I've started noticing patterns, things out of place in my apartment, objects I know I didn't move. A chair slightly angled toward the bed, a book left open to pages I didn't read, and the whispers, they're back. Louder now, closer. I've been trying to research what I might have released, but every avenue leads to dead ends or descriptions that chill me to my core. Whatever this thing is, it's ancient and it's patient. It knows I'm afraid, and I think it enjoys that. 2 nights ago, I woke up to the sound of my front door unlocking. I live alone, and the door has 3 deadbolts. I locked them all before going to bed, but as I lay there, frozen in my bed, I heard each bolt slide back, one by one. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just lay there, waiting. The door didn't open. There were no footsteps, no intruder, just silence. When I finally gathered the courage to check, the door was closed, the bolts were locked, and no one was there. But on the floor, just inside the door, was a small object wrapped in cloth. It was the disc. I haven't touched it. I don't know how it found me, but it's here, waiting. Hey, whatever came with it, I know it's not far behind. If you're reading this, and you ever come across something ancient, something unmarked or unexplained, don't touch it. Don't try to study it. Just leave it alone. I was in college, and one of my favorite things to do to distress was go to old, small theaters around the city. There was this particular one that played classic films once a month. It had a single screen, red velvet seats, and these faded gold embellishments along the walls. The building was ancient but charming, and I always found it comforting until one night in November. The film showing that night was Casablanca. It wasn't too crowded, which I liked. I bought my ticket, grabbed some popcorn, and found a seat in the middle row. When I settled in, I noticed someone sit 2 seats away from me, a man in a gray coat and dark scarf. He was unremarkable but polite, nodding slightly when I glanced his way. The movie started, and I was immediately absorbed, but about 30 minutes in, I noticed something odd. Every time there was a quiet moment in the film, I thought I heard whispering. It was faint, just barely audible, but enough to be distracting. At first, I assumed it was the man in the gray coat, maybe talking to himself or on his phone, but when I turned to look, he wasn't there anymore. His set was empty. I figured he must have gone to the restroom, so I refocused on the movie. me. The whispering didn't stop. In fact, it grew louder. I tried to ignore it, but my heart was pounding. It wasn't just random muttering, it was rhythmic, almost like a chant. And then came this weird, subtle pressure, like the air in the theater was heavier. I turned to look behind me. Nothing. No one was in the row directly behind mine. I looked back at the seat where the man had been sitting, still empty, but something about it seemed off. The way the light from the screen hit it made the fabric look darker than the others, like it had absorbed shadows that refused to let go. And then the seat creaked. My stomach flipped. No one was there. I don't know what possessed me, but I reached over and pressed my hand onto the seat's armrest. It was cold. Not the AC is on cold. I see. The whispering stopped instantly, like someone had clapped a hand over their mouth. I yanked my hand back and froze, staring at the seat, willing it to just be a trick of my imagination. The movie ended shortly after, and the lights came up. The theater was nearly empty by then, but I was too shaken to move. When the usher came to clean the aisles, I pointed to the seat and asked, "Did someone leave in the middle of the movie?" He frowned. "Not from this row." Why, I didn't know how to respond. Instead, I just stood and hurried out of the theater. I didn't go back to that place again, but I looked it up later. Turns out, it had a long history, including a fire decades ago that killed several people during a screening. And yeah, one of the victims had been sitting right in the seat I chose that night. After I left the theater that night, I tried to shake off the experience. I chalked it up to nerves, maybe a little leftover stress from school, but something about the whispering, the way it stopped so abruptly when I touched the seat, lingered in the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't quite reach. For weeks, I avoided that part of town. I even skipped the next month's classic movie screening, which hurt because it was one of my favorite traditions. But life went on, and soon I managed to convince myself it had been a weird coincidence. Maybe I imagined the whispers, maybe the cold state was just porking in. I moved all in until the postcards started showing up. It began innocuously enough. One afternoon, I found a plain white postcard in my campus mailbox. There was no return address, no stamp, just my name written on the front in neat, blocky handwriting. I turned it over. The only thing written on the back was a single word, "Remember." It gave me chills, but I figured it was a prank. College kids were weird, right? Maybe someone had overheard me talking about the theater incident and decided to mess with me. I shrugged it off, but then, a week later, another card came. This time, the handwriting was different, still blocky, but shakier, like the person was in a rush or unsteady. The word on the back said, "Stay." I told myself it was probably still a joke, but I couldn't help feeling uneasy. Who was leaving this? And why? I started locking my dorm room door religiously, even during the day. I told a few friends about it, and they laughed it off, telling me I was probably being paranoid. But the third card was the worst. I found it wedged in the crack of my dorm room door late one evening. This time, it wasn't just a single word, it was a sentence. The handwriting was different again, jagged and frantic, like whoever wrote it was pressing down too hard with the pen. It said, "You shouldn't have touched it." I dropped the card like it was burning my hand. My stomach sank. I had never told anyone about touching the seat. Not my friends, not even the usher I talked to that night. I hadn't told a soul. I didn't sleep that night. I kept my desk lamp on and sat up in bed, staring at my door, clutching my phone. Around 2 a.m., I swore I heard faint whispering again. Not in my room, but somewhere outside, maybe down the hall. It was the same rhythmic murmur I'd heard in the theater. I wanted to cry, but I was too terrified to move. The postcard stopped after that night. No more words, no more whispers. I never figured out who sent them, and honestly, I didn't want to. I graduated a few years later and moved far away. But sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet room, I still hear that faint, rhythmic whispering, just barely audible over the hum of life. I don't know what I touched in that theater, or what followed me after, but one thing's for sure, wherever it came from, it hasn't completely let go. Years passed, and life carried on. I moved to a new city, started a steady job, and built a routine. The memory of that theater incident dulled with time, like a bad dream you could almost convince yourself didn't happen. I never saw another postcard, and the whispering became so rare and faint that I could almost dismiss it as my imagination. Almost. But then, about a month ago, I got a package. It was a nondescript brown box, left at my apartment door with no return address. The sight of it immediately set me on edge. Something about its weight in my hands felt wrong. I debated throwing it out unopened, but my curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a single item, an old, scratched movie ticket. It wasn't from the theater I'd visited all those years ago, but it was similar enough to make my chest tighten. The date on the ticket was from 1943, the year of the fire I'd read about. The title of the film was illegible, smudged into oblivion, but I recognized the name of the theater. And that wasn't the worst part. The seat number printed on the ticket was the same one I had sat in, row F, seat 13. My hand shook as I stared at the ticket. Why was this being sent to me now? After all these years, why couldn't this thing, whatever it was, leave me alone? I shoved the box and its contents into a closet, slammed the door, and tried to forget about it, but ignoring it didn't work. That night, I woke up to the sound of whispering again. again, louder this time, and unmistakable. It was in my apartment, coming from the closet where I'd stuffed the ticket. The whispers were no longer faint or indistinct. They were sharp, clear words, though not in any language I could recognize. It sounded like a crowd speaking in unison, overlapping and echoing like they were in a cavern. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. At sunrise, I opened the closet, grabbed the ticket and the box, and drove them to the nearest dumpster. I threw them in, covered them with trash, and drove away, thinking I'd rid myself of it. But when I got home, the box was sitting on my kitchen counter. I froze. My front door was locked. My windows were latched. There was no way anyone could have gotten in, and yet there it was, the box with that cursed ticket inside. I knew then that this wasn't something I could escape. Whatever I disturbed in that theater, it had attached itself to me like a parasite. I didn't know what it wanted, but it was growing bolder, more insistent. Over the following days, the whispers escalated. They followed me everywhere, on my commute, at work, even in the middle of conversations. Sometimes they'd stop for hours, and I'd think I was free, only for them to return louder and angrier than before. Shadows in my apartment began to feel deeper, like they were watching me, shifting when I wasn't looking. My reflection in the mirror didn't always move with me. In every morning, the box would appear somewhere new in my apartment, no matter where I left it the night before. I don't know how much longer I could take this. Writing this is my last hope. Maybe someone will recognize what's happening to me or know how to stop it, because it's not just the whispers anymore. Last night, I woke up to a pressure on my chest. My bedroom was pitch black, and the air was freezing. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, but I could feel it, something heavy and cold sitting on me, pressing down like it wanted to crush my lungs. Into the dark, I heard the whispering again, so close it felt like it was inside my head. Before I passed out, I swear I heard one word rise above the rest: stay. Last summer, my friends and I attended a small music festival in a sleepy mountain town. The event sprawled across the town square, with food trucks, artisan booths, and two main stages set against a backdrop of towering pines. It was a warm, golden evening, and the atmosphere was relaxed, kids chasing bubbles, couples swaying to the music, and groups like I was lounging on picnic blankets. About halfway through the evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains, I decided to wander off on my own. The crowd had thickened, and I wanted to explore the smaller vendors tucked into the side streets. One booth caught my eye. It wasn't flashy like the others, just a simple wooden table with a few small sculptures displayed. The vendor, a man in his late 50s, stood silently behind it. He wasn't interacting with anyone, just watching the festival with an expression that felt out of place, detached. I walked up to get a closer look at the sculptures, which were strange but captivating. They were small figures, maybe 6 inches tall, carved from wood. Each was posed in a way that felt unsettling. One was crouched as if hiding, another reaching upward like it was trapped in an invisible box. There was one figure in particular that caught my attention, a woman sitting on the ground, her head buried in her knees. "Do you make this?" I asked, trying to break the silence. The man looked at me for the first time. His eyes were sharp, like he was studying me. After a pause, he nodded. "They're beautiful," I said, though beautiful wasn't the right word. "They were haunting." "Take one," he said, his voice flat. "Oh, I don't have cash," I replied quickly. "Take it," he repeated, this time pushing the sitting woman's sculpture toward me. His hand was steady, but I noticed a faint tremble in his fingers. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to refuse, but something in his tone made me uneasy. I thanked him awkwardly and walked away with the sculpture tucked under my arm. The rest of the evening passed without incident, but when I got back to the Arab later that night, I finally had time to examine the sculpture more closely. It was intricately detailed, more than I'd realized. The folds in the woman's dress, the strands of her hair, the tension in her hands as they gripped her knees. It was remarkable, but it also gave me the creeps. I decided to leave it on the table in the living room. That night, I woke up to a soft sound, like someone shuffling through the house. My first thought was that one of my friends had gotten up, but when I listened more closely, I realized the sound wasn't coming from the hallway or the kitchen. It was coming from the living room. I got out of bed, heart pounding, and tiptoed down the hall. The shuffling stopped as soon as I reached the living room doorway. The light from a nearby street lamp cast long shadows across the room, and everything seemed normal except the sculpture. It was no longer on the table where I left it. It was on the floor, tipped onto its side. I stared at it, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe one of my friends had moved it, but when I checked, they were all still asleep. The next morning, I brought the sculpture back to the festival, determined to return it, but when I reached the spot where the man's booth had been, it was gone. I asked a nearby vendor if they knew where he went, but they gave me a confused look. There wasn't anyone there yesterday, they said. I didn't take the sculpture home with me. I left it on a bench near the square and walked away as quickly as I could. After leaving the sculpture on the bench, I felt a weight lift off my chest, but unease lingered lingered. The festival carried on in the distance, cheerful music and laughter drifting through the warm air. I tried to shake the whole thing off as a weird, isolated incident, convincing myself it was nothing more than a misunderstanding, though deep down, I wasn't so sure. When I returned to the airbroom later, my friends asked where I disappeared to. I just said I'd gone for a walk and didn't mention the sculpture or the strange vendor. They would have thought I was overreacting. Besides, I didn't want to give my paranoia any more fuel. We packed up and left the next morning. As the car wooed its way down the mountain roads, I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see the quiet man standing by the roadside, watching us leave. Of course, there was no sign of him. Weeks passed, and life went back to normal. I had almost convinced myself that the whole thing was just my imagination. But then, one night, I was home alone, working late on my laptop. I had the TV on in the background, and my cat was curled up on the couch beside me. It was around 11 p.m. when I heard it, the faint sound of shuffling. My heart dropped. It was the same sound I'd heard in the airbed, the soft, deliberate movement of something or someone. I froze, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. At first, I thought it might be my cat, but when I turned to look at her, she was staring intently at the doorway, ears flat against her head. The sound came again, louder this time. It was coming from the hallway. I grabbed my phone and stood up slowly, my entire body on high alert. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. There was no answer, just the oppressive silence of my empty house. Summoning all my courage, I crept toward the hallway, every step making my heart pound harder. When I reached the doorway, I flicked on the light and looked around. Nothing. I checked every room, every closet, even under the bed. The house was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Later that night, as I was trying to fall asleep, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I grabbed it, expecting a late night text from a friend, but when I looked at the screen, my blood ran cold. It was a photo. The image showed my living room, taken from the perspective of someone standing in the hallway. In the center of the photo, on the coffee table where I left it weeks ago, was the sculpture, the city woman, her head buried in her knees. I stared at the photo in disbelief, my mind racing. I knew I had left the sculpture at the festival. There was no way it could have found its way back to me. Before I could think too much, another text came through. This one was a message, just 3 words: "She's not yours." That night, I didn't sleep. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and drove to a friend's house, not stopping until I was safely inside. When I tried to show them the photo the next morning, it was gone from my phone as if it had never existed. The following weeks were some of the most unsettling of my life. Though I was staying with my friend, trying to feel safe again, strange things started to happen. It began subtly. Doors that I was sure I'd locked were slightly ajar when I returned. Lights flickered at odd times, though their wiring had never been an issue before. My cat, usually calm and friendly, began to hiss at empty corners of the room, her fur bristling for no apparent reason. I kept telling myself it was all in my head. Stress could explain a lot, right? Maybe I was just so on edge that I was noticing things I normally wouldn't. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. One night, I finally decided I couldn't let the paranoia take over my life anymore. I went back to my house, determined to prove to myself that nothing was actually going on. My friend offered to come with me, but I declined. I didn't want to drag anyone else into whatever this was. I got home just before dusk. Everything looked exactly as I had left it, calm, ordinary. I walked through each room, checking every corner, every closet, every space where someone or something could hide. It was empty. I sat down on the couch, relieved, and decided to make myself some tea to help me relax. That's when I saw it. Sitting in the center of my kitchen table was the sculpture, the same one I left on the bench at the festival, the same one that had supposedly been in that eerie photo. The woman was still in her haughty pose, head buried in her knees, but now something was different. Her hands, which had been gripping her knees tightly before, were now slightly outstretched, almost as if she was reaching for something or someone. My breath caught in my throat, and I backed away from the table. My mind raced. There was no way it could have been here. I had left it behind. I had seen it gone. In a moment of sheer panic, I grabbed the sculpture and threw it into a garbage bag. I tied the bag tightly, drove to the edge of town, and dumped it in a random dumpster behind a strip mall. I drove back home with shaking hands, convincing myself it was over. Whatever had been happening was connected to that sculpture, and now it was finally gone. But it wasn't. That night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. It wasn't loud, more like a soft murmur just on the edge of my hearing. I bolted upright, my heart pounding, and scanned the room. I didn't see anything at first. Then I noticed the faintest movement near the foot of my bed. The sculpture was there, but this time it was different. The figure had shifted. She wasn't sitting anymore. She was standing, her head still bowed but her arms now fully outstretched, as if she were reaching for me. I screamed, grabbed my phone, and bolted out of the house. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, locking the doors and fumbling to call my friend. When they picked up, I was in tears, trying to explain what was happening. They told me to stay put, and they'd come get me. I waited in that car for what felt like hours, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, half expecting expecting to see something or someone approaching. When my friend finally arrived, I jumped out and collapsed into their arms, too shaken to speak. The next day, we went back to the house together. The sculpture was gone, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over. This happened about 3 years ago when I was working as a horticultural assistant at a botanical garden. It was my first real job after college, and I loved spending my days surrounded by plants. Most of my tasks were fairly mundane: pruning, watering, pest control, but every so often we get special assignments. One of these involved an old greenhouse on the far edge of the property. It hadn't been used in decades and was mostly overgrown with ivy and moss. Management had decided to restore it for a historical tour series, and my boss asked me to start clearing it out. I've been inside once before on a guided walkthrough, and though it was dusty and damp, it seemed straightforward enough: remove debris, clear out overgrown plants, and take inventory of what was salvageable. On my first day working there alone, I arrived mid-morning with my supplies. The sun was bright, and the glass walls of the greenhouse made it feel like an oven. The work was harder than I anticipated. Some of the roots had grown deep into the floor, and I kept finding nests of insects in the soil trays. By early afternoon, I was sweaty, tired, and regretting not bringing a second water bottle. I was working on one of the back corners, clearing out a shelf of rusted gardening tools, when I noticed something odd. A series of tiny, scratched markings ran along the edge of the shelf, almost like tally marks. Curious, I leaned closer and realized they weren't random. Someone had carved words between the lines. "Don't let them out." My first thought was that it was some kind of prank or maybe a relic from when the greenhouse was still in use. Kids from nearby schools sometimes volunteered for gardening projects. Maybe one of them had a dark sense of humor. I brushed it off and went back to work. The second weird thing happened about an hour later. I was uprooting an old vine when I heard a noise, like a faint tapping. It was so soft I almost didn't notice it, but it came from above. Looking up, I saw nothing but sunlight filtering through the glass panes. I figured it was just a bird or a squirrel and went back to work. The tapping didn't stop. In fact, it got louder, more deliberate. It wasn't until I stood on my tiptoes to inspect the ceiling that I saw it, a perfectly round hole in one of the glass panes, about the size of a quarter. The tapping was coming from there, but nothing was on the other side. I remember feeling an odd chill despite the heat. As the afternoon wore on, the air inside the greenhouse grew stifling. I decided to call it a day and come back fresh in the morning. As I was gathering my tools, I noticed a second hole, this one in the lower pane of another wall. Unlike the first, this one had jagged edges, as though the glass had been pushed outward. That's when I realized something that made my stomach twist. The holes hadn't been there earlier in the day. I would have noticed them. I decided to leave, but as I was locking up the greenhouse door, I felt a sudden pressure in my chest, like I was being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I turned around, scanning the interior, and that's when I saw it, a faint outline of a figure on the far side of the greenhouse, obscured by the overgrowth. It didn't move, didn't react, just stood there. I didn't stick around to find out what it was. I bolted back to the main garden and reported everything to my boss, who promised to check it out the next day. When he came back, he said he didn't find anything, no figure, no new holes in the glass. He joked that I'd been working too hard and probably imagined it, but I knew what I saw. I refused to go back to that greenhouse, and thankfully I wasn't asked to. The restoration project was quietly cancelled a few weeks later. No explanation was given, but I heard whispers among the staff that a contractor had found something strange while surveying the foundation, something buried beneath the greenhouse that they wouldn't elaborate on. A few months after I quit working at the botanical garden, I bumped into one of my old coworkers, Sarah, at a coffee shop. We got to talking about the place, reminiscing about the plants, the staff, and some of the odd stories that circulated over the years. When the greenhouse came up, her face immediately darkened. "You heard about the incident, right?" she asked. I shook my head. I hadn't kept in touch with anyone after I left, so I had no idea what she was talking about. Sarah glanced around, as if to make sure no one was eavesdropping, then leaned in closer. "They were still trying to restore the greenhouse a few weeks after you left," she began. "The crew found more holes in the glass. Like, a lot of them, some so small you could barely see them, others big enough to stick your hand through. Management brought in an exterminator because they thought it was some kind of insect or pest making the damage." Sarah paused, her eyes wide. "But the exterminator, he didn't even make it through the first inspection. He walked in, took one look at the holes, and walked right back out. Didn't say a word to anyone, just packed up his gear and left." She told me that after that, the staff started avoiding the greenhouse altogether. People reported feeling uneasy whenever they got close to it. There were rumors of strange noises at night, scratching, tapping, even whispers. Some said they saw movement through the glass, like shadows darting between the plants. A few brave souls tried to record it on their phones, but the footage always came out distorted. What about the foundation? I asked. I heard they found something under the greenhouse. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Yep, that's what finally shut everything down. They brought in a surveyor to assess the structural integrity of the place, and he found what looked like an old well under the floor. It was covered by a heavy stone slab, probably from when the greenhouse was first built. She leaned in even closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. When they lifted the slab, they found a staircase. A stone staircase leading down into the ground. I felt a cold shiver run through me. Did they go down? Sarah nodded again, but her expression was grim. They sent someone, a specialist, I guess. He didn't come back up. What? I whispered, my voice barely audible. They sent a second guy down after him. She continued, her hands trembling slightly around her coffee cup. He was only down there for a few minutes before he came running back up. Wouldn't say what he saw, just kept muttering, seal it up, seal it up. They poured concrete over the whole thing the next day and shut the greenhouse for good. I sat there, stunned, my mind racing. I thought about the figure I'd seen that day, the holes in the glass, the strange markings on the shelf. Suddenly, everything felt connected in a way I couldn't quite understand, but didn't want to. What do you think was down there? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Sarah just shook her head. I don't know, and I don't want to know, but after everything that's happened, I'm just glad they sealed it off. Despite Sarah's chilling account, I couldn't stop thinking about the greenhouse. The image of the figure in the shadows and the idea of a staircase leading into the ground gnawed at me. I wanted to forget, to dismiss it as a bad memory or a misunderstanding, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't finished. Months later, curiosity got the better of me. I found myself driving back to the botanical garden on a crisp fall afternoon. I told myself it was just a casual visit, a nostalgic trip to a place I used to love. But deep down, I knew why I was really there. The garden was as beautiful as ever, with its meticulously maintained flower beds and sprawling lawns. Families strolled the paths, and children laughed in the distance. For a moment, I felt silly, like I let my imagination get the best of me. But when I made my way to the far edge of the property, the atmosphere changed. The greenhouse stood there, silent and imposing. It looked the same as before, but there was something different about the air around it, something heavy, oppressive. A chain link fence had been erected around it, with a sign reading "Do not enter hazardous area." The glass panes were grimy, and ivy had started reclaiming the structure, creeping over the roof like nature's attempt to erase it. I shouldn't have gone closer, but I did. My heart pounded as I approached the fence. Peering through the gaps, I scanned the interior. Most of the plants had withered or been removed, leaving behind empty pots and shelves. But then I noticed something odd. The floor wasn't fully covered in concrete. As Sarah had said, in the center of the greenhouse, there was a rectangular patch of dirt, untouched and bare. It was the exact spot where the well had been. That's when I saw it. A small hole in the center of the dirt, no bigger than a fist. It hadn't been there before. The edges looked fresh, like the earth had been pushed aside from below. My stomach turned as I watched the dirt around the hole shift, just slightly, like something beneath it was moving. A low, rhythmic tapping sound began, faint at first but growing louder. My breath hitched as I realized it was coming from beneath the ground. It wasn't random. It had a deliberate pattern: tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, pause, like a signal. I stumbled back from the fence, heart racing, and nearly collided with someone. It was one of the security guards, an older man with a no-nonsense demeanor. "You shouldn't be here," he said gruffly, his eyes narrowing. "Hi, I used to work here," I stammered. "I just wanted to see the greenhouse." His face softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "This area is off limits for a reason. You need to live." "What's going on with it?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "What's under there?" The guard hesitated, his expression guarded. "You don't want to know. Trust me. Just go." I wanted to press him, to demand answers, but the look in his eyes stopped me. It wasn't just annoyance or authority, it was fear. I left the garden that day and haven't returned since. But the memory of that hole, that sound, stays with me. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I think I hear the tapping again. Soft, rhythmic, insistent. This happened when I was in college, back in 2018. I was part of the student tech crew for events, which meant I spent a lot of time setting up equipment in the campus auditorium. It was a large, old space with rows of heavy, red velvet seats and a balcony that always seemed to be covered in a thin layer of dust no matter how often it was cleaned. One evening, we were setting up for a speaker event the following morning. It was around 8 p.m., and most of the campus was already deserted. My friend Josh was up in the control booth testing the lights while I worked on the stage, adjusting a podium mic. The auditorium was dim except for the spotlight shining on the stage. I heard it then, a soft creak from one of the seats. Not unusual, given how old the chairs were, but something about it made me pause. I glanced up and scanned the rows. No one yet. Josh, I called up to the booth. You hear that? Hear what? He replied over the comm system, his voice crackling slightly. Thought I heard one of the chairs move. He laughed. Relax, man, these seats are older than our parents. They grow if you even look at them. I shook it off and went back to work. A few minutes later, there it was again. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. It wasn't just the sound of a chair settling, it was the distinct thunk of the seat flipping down, like someone had sat in it. I turned around sharply, my eyes scanning the auditorium. My skin prickled when I saw it. One of the seats, halfway back in the middle row, was down. Every other seat around it was upright. Josh, I hissed into my mic. There's a chair down. What? He sounded annoyed, probably thinking I was messy with him. I'm serious. Look at the middle row. Someone's sitting there. Josh turned the house lights up, flooding the room with harsh brightness. I blinked against the sudden glare, but when I looked back, the chair was upright again, as if nothing had happened. Dude, there's nothing there, Josh said, now sounding more exasperated than amused. I swear it was down. I muttered, whatever, let's just finish up. We worked for another hour or so, and I convinced myself I'd imagined it. The mind plays tricks when you're tired, right? But as we were packing up to leave, I glanced back one last time from the stage. That same chair was down again. I froze, feeling cold all over. Josh, I whispered, not taking my eyes off the seat. It's down again. Josh was already halfway out the door. He stuck his head back in and frowned at me. What are you? He followed my gaze and saw it too. His face went pale. We stood there in silence for a moment before the chair slowly flipped back up, the sound echoing through the empty auditorium. We bolted out of there without another word. The next day, I asked the janitor if he'd ever noticed anything strange about the auditorium. He gave me a long, tired look before saying, that chair. Yeah, it's been like that since I started here. No one likes to sit in it. When I pressed him for more details, he shrugged. Back in the 70s, some guy, student, I think, had a heart attack during a play. Died right in that chair. A couple of weeks later, I couldn't avoid the auditorium anymore. There was another event, and this time the whole tech crew was needed. We were setting up for a play, and I figured with more people around, I wouldn't feel so uneasy. I didn't tell anyone else what had happened, not even Josh. I didn't want to sound like I was losing it. The setup went smoothly. I managed to ignore that part of the room entirely, refusing to look in the direction of the chair. By the time we were done, it was late again, but I felt a bit braver. Nothing weird had happened, and maybe the janitor's story had just gotten under my skin. The play itself ran for 3 nights. On the second night, one of the actors, a senior named Ellie, approached me during intermission. She looked shaken. Hey, oh, have you noticed anything ... off in here? She asked. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? Well, she hesitated, glancing over her shoulder like she was afraid someone might overhear. During the first act, I swear I saw someone sitting in the middle row, right in the middle, but when I glanced back, they were gone. I tried to act casual, though my palms were clammy. Maybe it was someone who left to use the bathroom. She shook her head. No, the house lights were down, and they weren't there before the show started. I thought I imagined it, but I don't know. Her voice dropped to a whisper. It felt weird, cold. I could see the hairs on her arms standing up, and I realized I'd been gripping my clipboard so hard my knuckles were white. I didn't tell her about the chair. I just mumbled something about how old buildings can feel creepy and quickly found a reason to walk away. That night, after the play ended and everyone cleared out, I lingered behind with Josh and a couple of other crew members to pack up some of the equipment. I couldn't stop glancing toward the chair, expecting it to move, or flip down, or do something, but it didn't. As we were locking up, Josh stopped suddenly at the exit. Hey, he said, his voice tight. Did any of you guys notice? There was an extra program on that chair tonight. What? I turned to look, but the house lights were already off. All I could see was a vague shape where the rows of chairs were. It was folded, just sitting there. Josh muttered, almost to himself. I thought maybe someone left it, but never mind. Let's get out of here. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I went back to the auditorium during daylight, determined to prove to myself that it was all in my head. It was bright, quiet, and felt entirely normal. For a moment, I thought I was being ridiculous, and then I saw it. The chair was down, and on the seat was a single, folded program from the play. My heart started racing as I picked it up with trembling fingers. Scrawled on the back in messy handwriting was a single word, stay. After that final encounter, I was done with the auditorium. I swapped shifts with other tech crew members, avoided anything related to the space, and made it a point to never mention the incidents to anyone outside of Josh and Ellie. But as much as I wanted to forget about it, the chair didn't seem ready to let me go. A few weeks later, Ellie texted me late at night. Ellie, hey, did you ever notice anything weird with that chair? I stared at my phone, debating whether to respond. Finally, I typed out a cautious reply. Lee, why do you ask? She sent a picture. It was of the chair, down as always, with a folded folded playbill sitting on it. I felt a wave of nausea. The photo wasn't from the auditorium, it was taken from a study lounge on campus, one of those generic, quiet spaces where students cram during finals. The same chair, or one exactly like it, was now sitting in the corner of the room. Ellie, I swear this wasn't here earlier. No one else is here, and the janitor said he didn't move it. Is this the same chair? My heart raced. It wasn't possible. The auditorium's chairs were bolted to the floor, but the shape, the fabric, the scratches on the armrests, it was identical. I didn't know how to respond, so I didn't. The next morning, I went to the study lounge. The chair was gone. I asked Ellie about it, and she said the janitor claimed he had no idea where it came from or where it went. She brushed it off as a prank, but I could see in her eyes she didn't believe that. The thing is, that wasn't the last time I saw it. Over the next few months, the chair started appearing in random places around campus, the library, a corner of the dining hall, even in the hallway outside one of my classes. No one else seemed to notice anything strange about it, but every time I saw it, my chest tightened and my skin felt ice cold. The worst part, each time I saw it, there was something left on the seat. A pen, a crumpled piece of paper. Once, it was a single coin, all small, insignificant objects, until the last one. I was walking through the student union late one night, heading to grab something from the vending machines, when I saw it. The chair was sitting near the back of the room, almost hidden in the shadows. My heart sank as I realized there was another folded program on the seat. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I walked over, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The program looked old, the edges yellowed and frayed. With shaking hands, I opened it. Inside was a photograph. It was black and white, grainy, and showed the auditorium as it must have looked decades ago. In the picture, the rows of chairs were full of people, but one figure stood out. In the middle row, directly where the chair would be, sat a man. He was slumped forward, his head turned slightly toward the camera, his expression blank and lifeless. I dropped the photo and backed away, my heart pounding. I couldn't bring myself to pick it up, couldn't even bring myself to stay in the room. I ran out and didn't look back. After that, the chair disappeared. No one mentioned it, and I never saw it again. I graduated and moved far away from campus, hoping that was the end of it. I was attorney at a remote weather station deep in the Rocky Mountains. My job was mundane but peaceful, logging daily readings, checking instruments, and maintaining communication with the central office. The station itself was a small, squat building perched on a ridge, surrounded by endless wilderness. It was quiet up there, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. It was my 4th week into a 2-month assignment, and I had just settled into the routine. Days were spent taking readings, and nights were a mix of stargazing and reading. The station had a small kitchen, a single cot, and just enough equipment to keep me occupied. One evening, as the sun was sinking below the horizon, I stepped out to log the temperature and wind speed. The sky was a swirly mix of purple and gold, and the air had that sharp, biting chill that comes before nightfall. As I was jotting down the readings, I felt a sudden prickling at the back of my neck, the kind of feeling you get when you know someone's watching. I froze, my breath misting in front of me. Slowly, I turned around. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the expanse of pine trees stretching into the distance. But then, about 30 yards away, I saw movement. A figure, partially obscured by the trees, standing utterly still. "Hello," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure didn't respond or move closer. They just stood there, motionless. Something about their posture was off, too stiff, like they were a mannequin propped up in the woods. I felt my stomach twist. After a minute of silence, I backed toward the station, keeping my eyes on the figure. Once inside, I locked the door and pulled the blinds. My heart was racing, but I told myself it was probably a hiker who got turned around. Still, the isolation of the place made it hard to shake the unease. That night, I tried to convince myself nothing was wrong, but as the hours ticked by, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint tapping on the window. My blood ran cold. The blinds were closed, but the sound was unmistakable, like someone lightly drumming their fingers against the glass. I sat frozen on the cot, clutching the radio I used to communicate with the central office. The tapping stopped after a few seconds, only to start again at another window. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the nearest window. Heart pounding, I yanked the blinds open and shone the light outside. Nothing, just darkness and the faint outline of trees swaying in the wind. The tapping continued sporadically for the rest of the night, always at a different window. I didn't sleep. By morning, the noises had stopped and everything seemed normal. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. The following evening, I was determined to stay inside and keep the doors locked. But around 9 p.m., the power went out. The station plunged into darkness, and my stomach dropped. I grabbed the flashlight and radio, but before I could do anything, I heard a low, guttural sound coming from outside. It wasn't human. It wasn't an animal I could recognize. It sounded rugged. I pressed myself against the wall, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The noise moved closer, circling the station, and then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. The power returned a few hours later, but I didn't dare leave the station. I radioed the central office and reported strange activity, but they brushed it off as wildlife or my imagination. I tried to rationalize everything that happened, but it never quite added up. Sure, the mountains are home to wildlife, and power outages aren't unheard of in such remote locations. But that noise, it was something I couldn't explain, and the tapping. Animals don't do that. Not like that. When my assignment ended, I packed my things and left the station without looking back. The relief I felt as I drove down the windy mountain road was overwhelming, like a physical weight lifting off my chest. I was grateful to be heading back to civilization, but part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, like unseen eyes were following me all the way down. Weeks passed, and I began to settle back into normal life. The events at the station started to feel like a bad dream, something my mind had exaggerated in the solitude. But then, about a month after my return, something happened that pulled me right back into that nightmare. I received a package in the mail with no return address. It was a plain cardboard box, sealed with cheap packing tape. Thinking it might be from one of my coworkers at the station, I'd opened it without much thought. Inside, I found a small, weathered notebook and a folded piece of paper. The notebook was old, its pages yellowed and brittle. It was filled with neat, handwritten entries, log notes, much like the ones I kept at the station. The entries spanned years, but they weren't mine. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Flipping through the pages, I realized the entries were from someone who had been stationed at the same weather outpost long before me. Most of the notes were standard, weather patterns, instrument readings, but as I got further into the notebook, the tone shifted. The writer started mentioning strange occurrences, figures in the woods, unexplained noises, tapping on the windows. My hand shook as I read the final entries. They were increasingly frantic, the handwriting erratic. The last entry was scrawled across an entire page in large, uneven letters. It's not an animal. It knows I'm here. I can't leave. I unfolded the piece of paper that had come with the notebook. It was a single sentence, printed in bold letters. You should have stayed away. I didn't know what to do. I contacted my former supervisor at the weather station and told him about the package. He sounded confused and a little uneasy, but assured me that no one had been stationed there before me for at least a decade. He suggested it might be some kind of elaborate prank, but his voice lacked conviction. The package left me rattled, but nothing else happened for a long time. I tried to move on, convincing myself that it had to be a joke, some sick game by someone who knew about my assignment. I even considered throwing the notebook away, but couldn't bring myself to do it. Then, about 6 months later, I started hearing tapping on my apartment windows. I live on the 3rd floor. At first, I tried to dismiss it as something explainable, branches scraping against the glass or a bird pecking. Maybe, but the pattern of the tapping was too deliberate. It would happen in bursts, 3 taps, then a pause, then another 3. It was rhythmic, purposeful, and worst of all, it always happened late at night when everything was still and quiet. The first time I heard it, I froze, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I was too afraid to look, so I sat there on my bed, staring at the wall, willing the noise to stop. After a few minutes, it did. I convinced myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew better. The tapping continued sporadically over the next few weeks. Sometimes it would happen 2 nights in a row, other times it would skip a week. I tried peeking out once or twice, but I never saw anything. It was like whatever, or whoever, was doing it knew the exact moment to stop. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I stayed up late, sitting in the dark with my phone in hand, ready to record if the tapping started again. Sure enough, around 2 a.m., I heard it, 3 sharp taps on the living room window. I held my breath and turned on the camera, creeping toward the sound. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone steady. I yanked the curtain aside and pointed the camera out into the night. Nothing, just the empty street below and the faint glow of a street lamp. But as I stood there, staring into the darkness, I felt it again, that prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I spun around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the window, my heart nearly stopped. There, pressed against the glass, was a handprint. It hadn't been there before. The print was smeared, like whoever had made it was dragging their hand down the window. I stumbled back, clutching my phone, and immediately called the police. They came quickly, but by the time they arrived, the handprint was gone. There was no sign of anyone outside, and the officers chalked it up to condensation or my imagination. But I knew what I saw. The tapping stopped for a while after that, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I started noticing small, unsettling things around my apartment. Items out of place, doors left ajar that I was sure I closed, faint scratches on the inside of my windowsill. I even found muddy footprints on my balcony one morning, despite the fact that my my apartment is on the 3rd floor and there's no easy way to access it. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of tapping, but this time, it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from inside my bedroom. The sound was faint, like someone was gently tapping their fingers against the wall. My chest tightened, and I lay there paralyzed with fear, straining to hear. The tapping moved, slowly, from one side of the room to the other. It was deliberate, like whatever was making the noise wanted me to know it was there. Finally, I mustered the courage to reach for my phone and turn on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, and for a moment, the room seemed empty. But then, in the corner near the closet, I saw it. A figure, pale, gaunt, and impossibly tall, crouched in the shadows. Its eyes were black pits, and its mouth twisted into a grin that was far too wide for its face. It stared at me, unmoving, as if it was waiting for me to do something. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I bolted from the bed, throwing the door open and running out of the apartment. I didn't stop until I was outside, surrounded by the glare of streetlights and the sound of passing cars. I haven't been back to the apartment since. I moved out the next day, breaking the lease without a second thought. I don't know what I saw that night, and I don't want to know. To this day, I keep the blinds closed at night, and I never sleep in complete darkness. But sometimes, when I'm alone and everything is quiet, I still hear the tapping. This happened about 6 years ago when I was in college. There was an annual book sale in the basement of our student union. Most of the time, it was a quiet affair with tables of used books, students browsing through stacks, and volunteers manning the cash boxes. I loved going every year because the deals were great, and it always felt like a treasure hunt. That year, I went on the last day of the sale, hoping to snag something interesting before they packed everything up. The basement was quieter than usual, with only a handful of people around. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and there was that familiar smell of old paper. I was flipping through a pile of yellowed paperbacks when I noticed a narrow doorway at the back of the room. It was marked with a handwritten sign that said more books. I'd never seen it before, and curiosity got the better of me. The doorway led to a dimly lit corridor with more tables lined up against the walls. The books here were older, dustier, and more random. There was no one else in the corridor, which made the silence feel heavier. Still, I kept browsing. It felt like I was unearthing forgotten treasures. After about 10 minutes, I noticed a man at the far end of the corridor. He was standing perfectly still, his back to me, looking at a shelf. I thought nothing of it at first, just another book lover, right? But then I noticed he wasn't actually browsing. He wasn't moving at all, just standing there, stiff as a statue. His posture was unnaturally rigid, and something about it made my skin crawl. I decided to move to the other side of the room, putting some distance between us. As I shifted to another table, I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was soft, but in the silence of the corridor, it sounded louder than it should have. I glanced toward the man and realized the sound was coming from him. He was tapping his fingers against his thigh in a weird, deliberate pattern. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause. I turned my back to him and tried to focus on the books, but the tapping got louder. When I finally looked back, he had turned to face me. His eyes were wide and unblinking, his face completely expressionless. The tapping had stopped. I froze. He was too far away for me to make out much detail, but something about his stare felt wrong. It wasn't like he was looking at me, more like through me. My chest tightened, and I decided it was time to leave. I walked briskly back toward the main room, trying not to look over my shoulder, but as I neared the doorway, I heard quick, shuffling footsteps behind me. Panic surged through me. I didn't turn around. I didn't stop. I just bolted through the doorway and back into the main basement room. When I got there, I glanced back. The man hadn't followed me. He was standing just inside the corridor, half hidden in shadow. His head was tilted slightly to the side, like he was curious about me. The tapping had started again, faint but steady. I backed away toward the exit, keeping my eyes on him the whole time. As I reached the stairs, he took a single step forward, still tapping. That was all I needed. I turned and ran up the stairs 2 at a time, not stopping until I was out in the open air. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but something happened a few weeks later that made me wonder if I'd really escaped that man in the corridor. One night, around 2 a.m., I was in my dorm room working on an essay. My roommate had gone home for the weekend, so I had the place to myself. The building was quiet, the kind of stillness you only notice in the dead of night. My desk was near the window, which overlooked the campus quad, dimly lit by a few scattered lampposts. I was deep into my essay when I noticed movement outside. A figure was standing near one of the lampposts, right in the middle of the quad. At first, I thought it was just someone taking a late night walk or maybe a student heading back from a party. But as I watched, I realized they weren't moving. They were just standing there, staring up at my building. I turned off my desk lamp, hoping to make it harder for them to see me. My heart started to race as I peered through the blinds. Even in the dim light, I could tell it was a man, and he wasn't just looking at the building, he was looking directly at my window. I tried to convince myself it wasn't the same man from the book sale. I couldn't make out his face, but something about his posture, that stiff and unnatural stillness, felt eerily familiar. I told myself it was a coincidence, that it was late, and I was just letting my imagination run wild. But then, he moved, slowly, deliberately. He raised his hand. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized he was tapping his fingers against his thigh in the exact same pattern I'd heard in the corridor. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I watched him take a few steps closer to the building. I grabbed my phone and dialed campus security, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hit the buttons. When they answered, I whispered what was happening, trying not to let my voice carry. By the time I hung up, the man had disappeared. 1 second, he was there, and the next, he was gone, like he'd melted into the shadows. Campus security arrived about 10 minutes later. They searched the quad and the surrounding area but didn't find anyone. They told me it was probably nothing, maybe just a drunk student or someone passing through. But I knew better. I knew it was septic. After that night, I started keeping my blinds closed and my door locked, even during the day. I never saw him again, but for months, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Sometimes, when I was walking across campus or sitting in class, I'd feel that same cold, crawling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was standing just behind me, watching and waiting. Even though I moved to a different city and started fresh, the unease followed me, lurking like a shadow I couldn't shake. For months, I was hypervigilant, double-checking locks, avoiding walking alone at night, and scanning every crowd for a familiar stiff posture or tapping fingers. Eventually, life moved on, and I got a job, made new friends, and built a routine that left little room for paranoia. The encounters became a strange story I only shared with close friends, always ending with the same line, "Let's not meet." That was until 2 years later, when something happened that made my blood run cold. I was working late one evening at my office downtown. It was an open-plan space with rows of desks, the kind of place that felt soulless after hours when the hum of the coffee machine and distant chatter of coworkers disappeared. I was alone, or so I thought. I had stayed late to finish a report, determined to clear my workload before the weekend. Around 10 p.m., as I was packing up to leave, I noticed something odd on my desk, a book. I hadn't brought a book to work that day. In fact, I hadn't brought a book to work in weeks. My chest tightened as I reached for it, my fingers trembling slightly. The cover was faded and yellowed with age, the title barely legible, but I recognized it immediately. It was one of the books I browsed in the basement corridor that day. I looked around, my heart pounding. The office was silent, and I could see no movement beyond the glow of my desk lamp. The security cameras, I remembered with a pang of dread, had been down for maintenance that week. I wasn't sure what to do. Tentatively, I flipped the book open. Inside the front cover, in small, precise handwriting, was a note. Tap, tap, tap. I slammed the book shut and grabbed my bag, leaving everything else behind. As I rushed to the elevator, I swore I heard faint tapping coming from somewhere behind me. I didn't look back. When I got home, I called the police. I tried to explain the situation, but I could tell they didn't take me seriously. No threats, no signs of forced entry, just a book and some paranoia. They promised to file a report, but I could tell it was going nowhere. That night, I barely slept. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow a potential threat. I kept the book in a sealed bag, intending to hand it over to the police, but the longer I stared at it, the more I wanted to throw it into the nearest dumpster and pretend it never existed. The following week, strange things started happening. First, I noticed small objects in my apartment moving, nothing dramatic, just enough to unsettle me. A chair pushed slightly out from the table, my keys not where I'd left them. Then, the tapping started. At first, it was faint and intermittent. A tap 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 on my window late at night, even though I lived on the 5th floor. Then it moved closer, on the walls, the floors, even my bedroom door. I checked with my neighbors, but no one had heard anything unusual. One night, as the tapping reached its loudest and most persistent, I shouted into the darkness, "What do you want?" The tapping stopped. The silence was deafening. For a moment, I thought I'd scared whoever or whatever it was away. But then, from the other side of the door, I heard it, a soft, deliberate voice mimicking my own. "What do you want?" I froze. My legs wouldn't move. My breath caught in my throat. The voice sounded like mine but distorted, like it was coming through a crackling radio. Then, the tapping resumed, louder and faster than before. I don't remember much of what happened next. I think I grabbed my phone and bolted out of the apartment, calling a friend to come get me. I stayed with them for a few days, too terrified to go back. When I finally returned, nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I broke my lease in moved across the country shortly after. I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened, convincing myself it was a combination of stress, exhaustion, and coincidence. But every so often, I'll hear that familiar pattern, tap tap tap, pause, tap tap tap, and my stomach will drop. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.